Stock markets bounced back, boosted by a rally in tech stocks. Turkey seeks to strengthen Islamic finance in its banking sector. And we explore the G20 summit in Rio, where leaders aim to tackle poverty, hunger and climate finance. But are their goals compatible with the aims of the BRICS organization? Hello, I'm Toba Aydin with the latest business and finance news here on TRT World. Asian stocks traded mostly higher on Tuesday, tracking gains on Wall Street. Japan's Nikkei climbed 0.55%, while the broader Topix was up 0.47% by the midday break, driven by chip-related stocks after the Nasdaq closed higher overnight, as investors await AI leader Nvidia's quarterly earnings. Chinese stocks slipped to a two-week low, while Hong Kong shares steadied as investors await further details of economic stimulus from Beijing. US bond yields and the dollar hung back from multi-month highs during President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet selection and sought to gauge the outlook for Federal Reserve easing. Meanwhile, a jump in Tesla shares sparked a broader rally in tech stocks, with the Nasdaq snapping a four-day losing streak following a post-election sell-off. Let's get more on this now with Jamil Ahmed, Chief Analyst at GTC. Good to have you back on the program, Jamil. Firstly, let's talk about Tesla. The stock is up around 35% so far since Trump reclaimed the White House. But what's behind the most recent boost?
Well, Trump promised deregulation, and deregulation in the terms of Tesla would mean easing the route towards more self-driving electric vehicles and cars. Of course, Tesla is also founded by Trump's biggest supporter and most vocal supporter on this campaign trail, as well as the founder of X and Twitter. And we also know that Elon Musk is set to take a very senior position within the Trump administration. So I think when you combine all these factors together, that's what's driving Tesla stocks higher, because Trump owes him one. At the same time, electric vehicles, deregulation, that's another reason why we've had the bump in price early this week.
Right, and over in Asia, officials have gathered at an investment summit in Hong Kong to discuss potential stimulus measures. How much is needed to help China's economy?
Considering the data and that now we're in real jeopardy and risk of China not achieving its 5% government GDP target, which would be big problems for the global economy as well, I think that it's not an overestimate to say that China can and might throw a kitchen sink at the problem. Stimulus from all types of different areas of the economy. We did see stimulus over the couple of months. However, that might have been a bit too late to aid the Q3 data. Whereas now we're already in Q4 and we do have question marks over the 5% GDP target. I do think China will look to do more. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if China does do more by the end of this week, or if not, by the end of this month.
Meanwhile, all eyes are on Nvidia, which is expected to release earnings on Wednesday. What are your expectations?
Well, so far, from the perspective of Nvidia and for investors, the AI darling has not let anybody down. It continues to go higher and higher, and that mammoth stride towards world's richest company in the world at one point, I think that investors are going to be looking at very closely, also because 93% of the S&P 500 have already announced their earnings expectations for the quarter. So Nvidia is probably last but not least, and that's why I think investors are going to be watching this very closely. But so far, the AI giant has not disappointed, and I would not expect Nvidia to start disappointing investors quite yet.
All right, Jamil Ahmed, Chief Analyst at GTC. Thank you very much, as always. Now a quick look at some of the other top business stories from around the world. Boeing plans to lay off more than 2,500 workers in the US as part of a global reduction of 17,000 jobs, representing 10% of its workforce. Workers in Washington, Oregon, South Carolina and Missouri will be hit hardest. Another round of layoffs is expected in December, and the company may also cut jobs through attrition, selective hiring and selling subsidiaries. Japan and the UK have agreed to hold regular high-level talks on economic security following a meeting at the G20 summit. The new economic 2+2 talks will focus on trade, economic security and countering coercion, particularly from China. Leaders also discussed boosting defence cooperation, addressing global issues like East Asia and Ukraine, and collaborating on a new fighter jet project by 2035. China's largest express delivery company, SF Holding, plans to raise more than $792 million in a Hong Kong listing. The company will issue 170 million shares at a range of $4.15 to $4.66. SF Holding says that 45% would be spent on growing its international business and around $141 million on joint ventures and minority investments. And the US Department of Justice plans to ask a judge to force Google to sell its Chrome browser, alleging illegal monopolization of the search market. The DOJ also seeks measures related to AI and Google's Android operating system. This move is one of the Biden administration's boldest actions against big tech monopolies. Google has defended its practices, claiming strong competition and user choice in search engines. In the UK, consumer rights group Which has filed a lawsuit against iPhone maker Apple, alleging the company forces its customers to use its iCloud services. If the company is found to have broken the rules, around 40 million Apple customers in the UK could get a payout. Tulay Kalyon Haznederoğlu has more.
Apple is facing a landmark suit in which it's accused of ripping off its customers. The near $3.8 billion lawsuit raises questions about the way it deploys the iCloud. Consumer group Which also accuses Apple of locking 40 million British customers into its aforementioned service.
Now, what the principle is, they're saying that people are being trapped into using Apple iCloud services through preferential treatment. And what happens at the moment when you upload all of your material, you get a certain amount of storage for free. But what happens once you reach that storage, you're then forced into basically getting the iCloud services. And the iCloud services, the fees have increased by about 20 to 29% in June 2023. And what Which are claiming is that it's a lack of competition which has led to the overcharging.
If the action is successful, Apple customers in the UK could be entitled to an average payout of $88 each.
The result is you could be entitled to multi-million pounds of compensation if they get it wrong, because it's done on a percentage of global turnover. And there have been many famous cases of Google have been in there about potentially abusing their position regarding advertising and so on and so forth. So I always say where there's a hit, there's a writ. And boy, there's a big hit with Apple at the moment.
Which says the class action involves all UK customers who had paid for iCloud services since October 1st, 2015. This is Apple's second antitrust case following the one in the US, and it seems like there might be even more cases under EU's competition law. But cases against big companies can take up to years as they work their way through the courts. Apple strongly believes Which's accusations are incorrect, so it intends defending the case. Tulay Kalyon Haznederoğlu, TRT World, London.
Let's get more on this now with Chris Stoker-Walker, a technology journalist and author who joins us from Newcastle in the UK. Good to see you, Chris. Now, if this lawsuit is successful, what potential financial and operational impacts could Apple face? And how might this influence its business strategies both in and outside of the UK?
Yeah, well, if we take each of those in turn, the financial hit would be relatively significant. Obviously, Apple makes an awful lot of money in that sort of $7.75–8 billion hit. If this were to be successful in the UK, would be a significant chunk of that, but it wouldn't be an overwhelming amount of that. I think more telling would be the reputational damage to Apple and the way that it would have to try and unpick this, because one of the things that has made Apple quite so successful over pretty much the last 20 years. We had the Apple iPhone released in 2007, and we're approaching, obviously, the 20-year anniversary in the next few years, is the idea that Apple has a kind of locked-in ecosystem. You can get an iPhone or an iPad or something like that, and then you don't really have to worry about anything else. And so they offer their iCloud service by default so that you don't have to sign up to a third-party profile. And I think that will be the real significant change here, because one of the reasons that which is bringing this lawsuit is that they're alleging that Apple essentially makes it more difficult for third parties to actually gain access to the operating system. So that would be, I think, the more significant change, and could potentially augur more action elsewhere around the world beyond just the UK.
Right, and does this reflect broader concerns about consumer rights and corporate accountability in the tech sector?
I think it does. It's notable, obviously, as you started this bulletin, that we were talking also about Google and the action being taken against its Chrome browser in the United States. We are seeing, I think, a head of steam and a recognition that perhaps over maybe the last 25 or so years, we have had big tech dominance over our lives in ways that are both beneficial for us, but also sometimes can be a little bit detrimental. And I think that's starting to recognize that and take action against it, where we go, actually, big tech companies have maybe overstepped the mark a little bit in some areas, is really starting to come down and bear upon these companies. So yes, I think that this is kind of feeding into a broader wave of action against big tech companies. And obviously Apple is one of the biggest. We talk about the GAFA group, which is the Google, Apple, Facebook and Amazon group of big tech companies, and Apple is a key part of that as well. So I do see this kind of being a broader action against big tech and a lashing out against them more generally.
And what are the possible implications for UK customers, especially those who have used or are currently using Apple's iCloud services?
Yeah, well, it's looking fundamentally like if this does succeed, and one of the key things to say is this is a class action lawsuit. It is brought by a consumer group which in the UK that is highly respected, although these things are often very difficult to kind of prove and win over in a court of law. And it is notable, I think, when which launched this legal action, that they were saying actually to Apple, it might be sensible for you to settle out of court, which could be an indication also of which is both strength, but also potentially an acknowledgement of their weakness, and they're worried that they might not win this. But if they did, then it would mean a payout for any user that has used the iCloud service of around about 70 Great British pounds, which is, as you said, around about $80 in the US. So this would be, I think, a little bit of a payout for them. Obviously, for those who have been locked into the system, which would allege, they might well have spent far more than that on their storage through Apple, and so that might be small compensation for what has been a relatively big problem for them in the past.
All right, Chris Stoker-Walker, we will have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. World leaders at the G20 summit have pledged to work together towards eliminating global poverty and hunger. The initiative was announced by the host country Brazil on the first day of the gathering in Rio de Janeiro. Craig Boswell has the details.
World leaders arrived at the G20 summit, walking along a red carpet leading to a reception with Brazil's president atop a somewhat steep incline. President Biden was given an alternative path. Once inside, the host country announced the first major initiative.
I want to announce the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty.
It's an effort to help feed some 733 million people worldwide.
This will be our major legacy. We strive for more than justice, but to build a world at peace.
But it's war that hangs over the summit, particularly the bloody conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine.
And I have come to Rio with a simple message. G20 leaders must lead.
Deep divisions remain on simply how to talk about the conflicts, much less find solutions. But there was a breakthrough in talks on climate finance here at the G20, though diplomatic sources call it a fragile consensus on text mentioning developing nations' voluntary contributions to climate finance. They stopped short of calling them obligations. The agreement is overshadowed by the election of Donald Trump and the expectation that he'll undo any climate agreements. In spite of that, Joe Biden is pressing ahead with a clean energy partnership with Brazil's president to be announced Tuesday. On Monday, Biden announced a contribution to a fund for the world's poorest countries.
I'm proud to announce the United States is pledging $4 billion over the next 3 years to the World Bank's International Development Association.
Leaders also discussed global governance reform.
And it's basically making people's lives better and how to do that. And the challenge for all of these leaders is to make it relevant to people. How are you going to do it? How are you going to deliver? And that's been the biggest problem with these big events.
Strategic partnerships are often forged in smaller bilateral meetings. Many countries this year have the goal of better positioning themselves to mitigate any major U.S. economic and trade policy changes when Trump returns to the White House next year. Day 2 of the G20 will focus on sustainable development and energy transitions. Greg Boswell, TRT World, Rio de Janeiro.
The G20 summit is underway in Brazil just a few weeks after the BRICS summit ended in Russia. The back-to-back scheduling of these major multilateral summits highlight potential conflicts of interest. Last year, India hosted the G20 summit. This year, it's Brazil. And next year, South Africa will take the lead. All key BRICS members. While BRICS countries are part of the G20, these two economic blocs reveal their largest conflicts of interest in the economic sphere. As BRICS continues to push for global convergence, it also calls for reforms, such as use of local currencies in international trade. This contrasts with the G20, which, while addressing global issues, has maintained a focus on geopolitical stability rather than transformative economic change. This difference in priorities is further highlighted by the structural divide between BRICS and the G20. BRICS has now expanded to include more emerging economies, prompting inclusivity, while the G20 has maintained a traditional focus, prioritizing geopolitical interests with limited global South representation. The growing influence of the global South, comprising Asia, Africa, and Latin America, further complicates these dynamics. US trade with developing countries has dropped, while the number of countries where the US is the top trading partner has fallen from 130 in 2006 to 49 in 2021. Meanwhile, China's trade with sub-Saharan Africa has surged, surpassing US-Africa trade, signaling a shift in global economic power. For more on this, we're joined by Irina Muresan, a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogues in Johannesburg. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, how significant is the Global Alliance Against Hunger in addressing poverty and inequality, particularly for the Global South?
Thank you so much for having me. And look, you cannot have this context or this kind of conversation without referring to the climate emergency or climate-related shocks, especially because in the Global South, people are disproportionately affected by climate-related shocks like droughts, floods. And this really undermines food security, which is something that the Global South feels very passionate about and and experiences firsthand. So as you've discussed, trade policies, land ownership structures, foreign debt, these can really limit local access to resources. Large-scale agricultural subsidies from wealthier countries can also distort local food systems. And so we've seen a very harsh impact of disrupted supply chains as well, and how routes are impacted along conflict zones. This is bringing in the geopolitical dynamic. And so here in the recent G20, it's been significantly focused on addressing immediate hunger, malnutrition, sustainable agriculture, and the impact of women specifically.
Right, and how is the growing influence of BRICS reshaping global trade dynamics and challenging traditional G20 priorities?
It's a fantastic conversation to see unfold. The shift is primarily due to the BRICS' ability to kind of start to leverage diverse economies and growing markets and the collective drive for this call for economic sovereignty. And as you know, the G20 was created in the 90s specifically to address the East Asian economic crisis and the crises that came since then. And so the global financial and economic order is still underpinned by the success of these organizations and rules that support it. But when you think of the BRICS being able to transcend and leverage on regional opportunities to link institutional partnerships. Some BRICS are stronger than others. And so it's very difficult to also manage the purely competitive agenda in relation to how the goal of providing an alternative governance system for those who want to participate in a shared world, how they experience this as well.
All right, Irina Murasan, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogues. We will have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Turkey's finance structure is getting a shake-up after the President's Finance Office, the Islamic Financial Services Board and the Participation Banks Association of Turkey have pledged to work closer together. The country aims to increase Islamic finance's share of the banking sector to about 15% by 2025. Ömer Bakkaloğlu reports on what this ethical way of banking will mean for savers and investors in Turkey.
Islamic finance may have its roots in Muslim majority countries, but today it's a concept that's gaining traction far beyond these borders. The name might suggest a religious focus, but its principles are universal. It offers a model based on ethical and socially responsible investments, rejecting interest-based lending, and steering clear of industries like alcohol, tobacco, and gambling.
The rest of the world is discovering that Islamic finance is not for Muslims only. Anybody can benefit from it. And also they are discovering that the instrument that Islamic finance is using is very familiar to them. They use leasing, they use deferred sale, they use partnership kind of thing. These instruments exist in every society. And they are also discovering that Islamic finance can bring solutions to problems that continue to exist in conventional finance, like in social finance, in green finance, in financial inclusions.
The sector is projected to hit $5 trillion in assets by 2025, driven by an annual growth rate of up to 12% over the past decade.
Not less than 3 decades ago with zero assets, and now they are in over $4 trillion in terms of assets. And that just gives you an indication how competitive the industry is.
And this growth isn't just on a global scale. The sector, also known as the participation banking, is also playing a growing role in Turkey. The CBFO IFSB TKBB Forum, organized by the Presidency of the Republic of Turkey's Finance Office, in partnership with local and international regulatory bodies, is a crucial step toward further integrating Islamic finance into the country's economy. Turkey is doubling down on its push to expand Islamic finance with the goal of boosting its share in the banking sector to 15% by 2025. And events like this one at the Istanbul Financial Center highlight the country's commitment to reinforce its position as a dynamic hub for Islamic finance. The forum brought together representatives from various institutions to foster cooperation and encourage knowledge sharing.
We have stakeholders from regulatory bodies, central bank, from participation bank, and all other relevant stakeholders. We discussed the current situation of standards and regulations in Turkey, and we got some advices for further enhancement in the morning workshop.
As Turkey continues to pave the way, the sector's growth here could serve as a model for other nations looking to tap into ethical and socially conscious investments. Ömer Bakkaloğlu, TRT World, Istanbul.
French farmers have taken to the streets again, blocking roads and demanding action. They fear an EU trade deal with South America could harm their businesses and flood European markets with cheaper imports. Lara Kılıçaslan has the details.
Once again, French farmers have returned to the streets. The sound of tractors fills the air as they protest against the EU-Mercosur trade talks. The agreement aims to boost trade by removing taxes on goods. But farmers fear it will bring a flood of cheap imports from South America. They believe it threatens their businesses and creates unfair competition.
It's frustrating to resume the demonstrations. In January and February last year, we spent almost 2 months demonstrating. We were heard and the promises were made to us. However, nothing was done, and today we are here again to mobilize with almost the same demands.
Their demands are simple: They want their government to stand firm against the trade deal. The French officials have backed the farmers' concerns, and President Emmanuel Macron says he opposes the deal unless South America meets EU standards.
We don't want France to import products that aren't standardized like ours. In the end, it's like unfair competition. Our products are very standardized, very controlled, very closely monitored, and products from all over the world can arrive with completely different standards.
Supporters of the trade deal argue it will create business opportunities. They believe removing tariffs will boost exports to South America. But farmers are not convinced. They point to past surges in imports, like Ukrainian grain, which hurt local markets.
We don't want to import agriculture from these countries, since it's not produced according to the same standards as we have in France. We are capable of producing poultry, we are capable of producing beef, and we do not need to import all these things from these countries, especially when they're not in fact produced with the same level of quality as here.
Earlier this year, farmers across Europe blocked roads and buildings. They opposed EU rules, trade deals, and demanded fair policies. But their concerns were left unresolved. Now, they hope this new wave of protests will finally send a clear message to EU leaders. Lara Kılıçarslan, TRT World.
Well, that's all your business news for now. Thanks for watching.